The establishment of the Roman Forum marks one of the quiet but decisive moments in Rome's transformation from scattered hilltop settlements into a single political community. What had once been a marshy valley became a shared space, not owned by a clan or a king, but shaped collectively through use, ritual, and negotiation. More than a physical marketplace, the Forum represented a new way of living together. It was where disputes were settled, alliances formed, and memory made public. Its very existence suggests that Rome's identity did not emerge fully formed through myth or conquest, but slowly, through practical cooperation. In that sense, the Forum tells us something essential about Rome. Before it became an empire of armies and laws, it was first an agreement, a space where different groups learned to coexist, argue, and belong to the same city. The story of the Roman Forum does not begin with stone, or law, or monuments. It begins with a problem. Long before Rome imagined itself as a city, before it counted years, kings, or victories, the people who lived along the Tiber faced a question that was both simple and unsettling. How do different communities live together without ceasing to be themselves? The hills that would one day surround the Roman Forum were not empty. They were occupied, claimed, defended. Each hill, the Palatine, the Capitoline, the Quirinal, the Esquiline, held its own group, its own traditions, its own dead. These were not neighborhoods of a city. They were separate worlds within shouting distance of one another. Between them lay a low valley. It was wet, unstable, unclaimed, and that fact mattered more than any legend would later admit. Because shared space is never neutral. To share land is to negotiate power. To meet is to risk conflict. To gather is to acknowledge the presence of others and their claims. Rome's later myths would speak of brothers, wolves, divine ancestry, and destined rule. But the Forum speaks of something quieter and more difficult: compromise. The valley that would become the Forum was, at first, undesirable. Seasonal flooding from the Tiber turned it into marshland. Water pooled between the hills. The ground shifted. Burial rather than settlement marked its earliest use. And precisely because it resisted permanent occupation, no single group could easily claim it. This made it dangerous, but also possible. In early societies, power is often rooted in land that can be defended. A hilltop, a ridge, a boundary. Valleys are different. They invite passage. They expose movement. They force encounter. The Forum Valley was not chosen because it was ideal. It was chosen because no one could own it alone. This matters because Rome did not begin as a unified city imposing order downward. It emerged upward through repeated acts of coordination between groups that retained their own identities. The Forum was not the center of Rome because Rome already existed. Rome began to exist because the Forum made shared life unavoidable. Early Rome was not planned, it was accreted. Families clustered around hearths. Clans marked sacred ground. Custom governed behavior more than written rule. In this world, interaction across groups was limited and cautious. Trade occurred but temporarily. Rituals overlapped but rarely merged. Disputes were settled within communities, not between them. A shared space disrupts that logic. Once people begin to gather in the same place, repeatedly, predictably, they must develop new habits. Ways of speaking that do not presume kinship. Customs that can be recognized by outsiders. Expectations that restrain violence long enough for dialogue. The Forum forced these changes not by decree, but by necessity. You cannot meet regularly without learning restraint. You cannot trade without learning trust. You cannot argue in public without beginning to define fairness. The Forum was not Rome's heart because it was sacred or grand. It became Rome's heart because it was inescapable. One of the most revealing things about the Forum's earliest history is how little the Romans later said about its creation. There is no single founder credited, no divine vision preserved, no heroic conquest recorded. This silence is not accidental. Roman historians were comfortable mythologizing violence, kingship, and destiny, but cooperation, slow, collective, unglamorous, resists myth. It has no climax, no single hero, no moment of triumph. And yet, archaeology tells us what stories do not. Beneath later temples and basilicas lie layers of fill, deliberate attempts to raise the ground, to stabilize the valley, to make it usable. These efforts required coordinated labor, shared planning, agreement on outcome. Such work could not be done by one household or one hill community alone. The Forum was not born in a moment. It was built through repeated acts of consent. To create a shared space is to risk exposure. Private authority within a family or clan thrives on intimacy and control. Public space does the opposite. It makes behavior visible. It invites comparison. It allows others to judge. This is why many early societies resist public gathering places. Power is safer when interactions are limited and supervised. Rome did something unusual. It accepted a space where disputes could be witnessed. Reputation mattered beyond kin. Authority had to be justified, not assumed. The Forum did not eliminate hierarchy, but it changed how hierarchy operated. Influence increasingly depended on persuasion, precedent, and recognition, not merely lineage. This was not democracy, but it was something new. A community learning to exist in front of itself. Before Rome had laws written on bronze tablets, it had memory. The Forum became the place where memory accumulated, where oaths were remembered, where insults were not forgotten, where victories and losses lingered in public awareness. This mattered deeply in a culture without formal archives. To speak in the Forum was to risk being remembered. To act there was to place oneself within a growing civic narrative. Over time, this transformed behavior. People learned to appeal to custom rather than force, to reputation rather than threat, to shared expectations rather than private retaliation. The Forum did not impose order. It cultivated it. If Rome truly began in 753 BCE, as later tradition would claim, then the Forum should be an afterthought, a space added to a city already formed. But the evidence suggests the opposite. The Forum predates Rome as a political idea. It created the conditions under which Rome could later imagine itself as a single entity. Without it, there may have been Palatine Rome, Capitoline Rome, Quirinal Rome, but not Rome. This challenges the way we think about beginnings. Cities do not always start with walls or rulers. Sometimes they start with agreement. Agreement to meet. Agreement to return. Agreement to recognize others as participants in a shared future. The Forum was not a declaration of unity. It was an experiment in coexistence. Later Roman writers would search for origins that felt decisive. A date, a founder, a divine sign. The Forum offered none of these. Instead, it offered something more unsettling. No single moment of creation. No clear authorship. No guarantee of success. Only continued effort. In this sense, the Forum represents a different kind of foundation, not a mythic beginning, but a process. Rome was not founded once. It was repeatedly refounded, every time people chose to gather there rather than retreat to their hills. And this is why the Forum matters. Not because it was grand, not because it was sacred, but because it required people to live with difference, publicly, visibly, imperfectly. Before Rome ruled others, it learned to rule itself, not through law but through shared space. And that learning began here, in a wet valley, between hostile hills, without certainty that it would work. In the next chapter, we will descend further into that valley, into the marshland itself, to understand why geography, labor, and necessity shaped Rome long before ideology ever could. Before it was a place of voices, it was a place of water. The valley that would become Rome's forum lay exposed between rising ground, collecting runoff from the surrounding hills and overflow from the nearby Tiber River. In the rainy seasons, water pooled and stagnated. In drier months, the ground remained soft, unstable, and unreliable. It was not a place for houses, not a place for walls, not a place anyone would choose to inhabit. And yet, it was precisely this refusal to become anyone's home that made it consequential. The earliest archaeological layers show burials modest, scattered, temporary. The living stayed above. The dead were placed below. This separation was practical but also symbolic. Valleys absorbed what hills rejected. They were margins useful but avoided. Rome began in the margins. It is tempting to read geography as fate, to imagine that Rome rose because the land demanded it. But geography does not command, it constrains. The hills offered safety, visibility, and defensibility. They encouraged separation. Each ridge fostered its own community, its own rhythms, its own internal authority. The valley did the opposite. It made isolation difficult. Paths naturally converged there. Livestock routes crossed it. Seasonal movement required passage through it. The marsh could be avoided, but not indefinitely. This is where Rome's early history diverges from simple foundation myths. No one decided, in a single moment, to turn the valley into a center. Instead, the valley forced repeated decisions. Do we pass through today? Do we trade here? Do we meet again? Over time, repetition became expectation. Avoiding the valley carried a cost. Trade became inefficient. Communication remained indirect. Disputes escalated without neutral ground. As populations grew, these costs increased. The hills could protect communities, but they could not sustain complex interaction. A society that wished to expand economically, socially, ritually, required a space that belonged to no one and everyone. The marsh was not neutral by intention. It became neutral by exhaustion. No group could easily claim it. No group could easily exclude others. This fragile balance made the valley tolerable, then useful, then indispensable. The transformation of the marsh did not begin with temples or statues. It began with dirt. Fill was brought in. Ground was raised. Water was redirected. These acts sound simple, they were not. To reshape the valley required coordination across communities, agreement on shared benefit, willingness to invest labor without immediate ownership. This is where Rome's story becomes quietly radical. In many early societies, large-scale labor serves a ruler, a god, or a dynasty. In early Rome, the labor preceded all three. The valley was stabilized before it was monumentalized. The space was made usable before it was made symbolic. This order matters. It suggests that Rome's public life did not emerge from ideology, but from infrastructure. Water defined the problem and the solution. Seasonal flooding from the Tiber made the valley unpredictable. Any attempt to gather there required control over water flow. Over time, channels were cut, drains dug, and runoff managed. These early efforts would eventually culminate in the Cloaca Maxima, but the impulse came first. Water management is never purely technical. It requires shared standards, maintenance over time, collective responsibility. A neglected drain floods everyone. Thus, water bound communities together long before law did. To maintain the valley was to acknowledge mutual dependence. The marsh existed in a liminal state, neither fully sacred nor entirely mundane. Burials suggest ritual awareness. Drainage suggests practical necessity. This dual character shaped how the space was treated. Unlike hilltop sanctuaries tied to specific gods or clans, the valley resisted exclusive sanctification. No single deity dominated it. No lineage claimed ancestral priority. This openness made the space adaptable. Rituals could occur without full consecration. Markets could form without permanent structures. Assemblies could gather without formal authority. The valley was not defined by what it was, but by what it allowed. From the heights of the Palatine Hill and its neighboring ridges, the valley was always visible. This visibility mattered. Public space requires witnesses. A gathering hidden from view cannot become normative. The valley's openness ensured that actions taken there were seen and remembered. Over time, this visual relationship inverted power. What happened below began to shape what happened above. Decisions made in the valley affected hilltop life. Reputation forged in shared space carried weight back into private communities. The marsh became a mirror, reflecting behavior back to those who once believed themselves separate. At first, the valley was a place to cross. Then a place to pause. Eventually, a place to remain. This transition did not occur suddenly. It emerged through habit. A trader sets up where others already gather. A ritual repeats where the ground is known. A dispute is settled where witnesses are present. Presence accumulates. And with presence comes expectation. Once people expect others to be there, absence becomes noticeable. Withdrawal becomes political. The valley ceased to be optional. Rome's later power, its laws, armies, and empire, would depend on coordination at scale. But coordination does not begin with command. It begins with shared conditions. The marsh forced early Rome to confront those conditions. Environmental unpredictability, mutual dependence, the necessity of cooperation without coercion. By learning to manage water together, Rome learned to manage difference. This learning left no inscription, no founding date, no mythic hero, but it shaped everything that followed. It is important to remember that none of this was inevitable. The valley could have remained avoided. The hills could have hardened into rivals. Cooperation could have collapsed. That it did not is not proof of destiny, but of persistence. Each season, the marsh had to be managed again. Each generation, the space had to be reaffirmed. Rome's earliest success was not conquest. It was maintenance. And in that maintenance, the idea of a shared city slowly took form, not above the ground but beneath it. In the next chapter, we will follow that labor more closely, tracing how drainage, coordination, and collective effort transformed necessity into the first civic act of Rome. Rome did not begin by building upward. It began by digging down. Before temples rose, before speeches echoed, before stone marked memory, the people who gathered in the valley confronted a single, recurring reality: water returned. Every season, the marsh reclaimed the ground. Every flood erased effort. Every failure of maintenance reminded the hills that the valley was not tamed, only negotiated with. And in that negotiation, Rome discovered its first form of collective power. Early drainage was not a project. It was a habit. Ditches had to be cleared again and again, channels collapsed, embankments softened. There was no final solution, only continued attention. This is where the character of early Roman cooperation becomes visible. Unlike monumental works designed to impress gods or subjects, drainage demanded humility. It rewarded consistency, not spectacle. The work produced no immediate glory. Its success was measured in absence, the absence of standing water, disease, unusable ground. This kind of labor shapes social expectations. Those who fail to contribute become visible. Those who maintain become trusted. Those who coordinate become influential. Leadership emerges not through command, but through reliability. At first, labor likely followed kinship lines. Families maintained the sections closest to their routes of travel. Clans repaired what benefited them directly. But water does not respect boundaries. One neglected channel flooded another group's work. One collapsed bank undermined adjacent ground. Over time, the limits of private maintenance became clear. The valley demanded coordination. This transition from household labor to shared effort is one of the most important steps in Rome's early development. It marks the moment when cooperation moved beyond convenience and became obligation. Not enforced by law, not mandated by authority, but sustained by necessity. This is what makes the work revolutionary in its own quiet way. There were no architects in the modern sense, no written plans, no technical manuals. And yet solutions emerged. Channels were aligned. Water was guided toward lower outlets. Ground was raised with layered fill. Knowledge accumulated through practice. Failed methods were abandoned. Effective ones repeated. Over time, informal expertise developed, individuals who understood the land better than others, who could anticipate collapse, who knew where water would flow. These people gained influence, not because they commanded others, but because others depended on them. Rome's earliest authority was technical before it was political. Centuries later, Roman writers would marvel at the Cloaca Maxima, describing it as a wonder of the world, a symbol of Roman engineering genius. But the cloaca was not an invention. It was an accumulation. Each generation deepened channels. Each generation stabilized more ground. Each generation inherited both the benefits and the responsibilities of past labor. This continuity mattered. It created an unspoken contract between the living and the dead. We maintain what we did not create, so that others may use what we improve. Such thinking is foundational to civic identity. In the valley, status mattered less than effort. On the hills, lineage could dominate. In the marsh, competence prevailed. The work required bodies, tools, and time, not ancestry. This did not erase hierarchy, but it blurred it. When everyone depends on the same infrastructure, distinctions soften. The success of one group relies on the diligence of another. Resentment gives way to pragmatism. The valley taught Rome a crucial lesson. Shared vulnerability produces shared responsibility. The greatest achievement of early drainage was that it faded from notice. When the valley dried enough to host markets, gatherings, and rituals, few thought about the channels beneath their feet. Success became background. This invisibility is the mark of true infrastructure. What works best is what we forget. Rome's later obsession with visible power, arches, roads, walls began with something humbler, unseen channels carrying water away. Maintenance creates a moral economy. Those who benefit without contributing are resented. Those who contribute consistently are respected. Those who coordinate earn trust. Over time, these judgments harden into norms. Who is reliable? Who neglects shared duty? Who steps forward when repair is needed? The valley became a testing ground for character. Before Rome judged men in courts, it judged them in labor. It is tempting to assume that people first thought of themselves as Romans, then built Roman things. The evidence suggests the opposite. They built together before they named themselves together. Identity followed action. Shared labor created shared outcomes. Shared outcomes created shared expectations. Shared expectation slowly solidified into shared belonging. Rome did not declare itself a community. It practiced being one. None of this was stable. A season of neglect could undo years of work. A conflict between hills could halt maintenance. A breakdown in trust could flood the valley again. This fragility kept cooperation grounded. There was no illusion of permanence, only continuity through effort. Rome's earliest civic virtue was not ambition, it was persistence. By the time the ground stabilized enough to support regular gatherings, the valley had already shaped the people who used it. They had learned to coordinate without formal authority, to value function over display, to accept obligation without command. These lessons would define Roman public life long after the marsh was forgotten. The Forum did not civilize Rome. Rome civilized itself by building the Forum. And it did so not with words or myths, but with hands in the mud. In the next chapter, we will step onto the newly stabilized ground itself and examine how this space transformed from a work site into a place of exchange, argument, and shared presence. Once the ground began to hold, something changed. Not all at once, not by decree, but through use. The valley did not become important because it was declared sacred or monumental. It became important because people kept returning to it. What had been a work site slowly turned into a meeting place. What had been managed out of necessity began to be occupied by choice. This is the moment when the Roman Forum truly began, not as architecture, but as behavior. The first transformation was subtle. People stayed longer than required. A repair finished early. A delivery arrived late. A conversation continued after its purpose ended. These small extensions mattered. Lingering creates opportunity. Opportunity creates exchange. Soon, the valley hosted more than maintenance. Goods were laid out temporarily. News was shared verbally. Disputes were aired where others could hear. None of this required buildings. It required only presence, repeated, expected presence. The Forum emerged as a pattern, not a place. Early exchange in the Forum was informal. There were no stalls, no permanent claims, no fixed boundaries. Space was negotiated daily. Who arrives first? Who yields ground? Who has reputation enough to hold position? This fluidity prevented domination. No group could easily monopolize the space. No structure enforced permanence. Authority remained provisional, dependent on recognition rather than force. This daily renegotiation trained participants in a new skill, public compromise. You could not simply take. You had to persuade, accommodate, or wait. These habits would later underpin Roman political culture, long before formal institutions existed. What distinguished the Forum from other gathering places was visibility. Actions taken there were seen. Words spoken there were overheard. Promises made there were remembered. This visibility altered behavior. A private insult can be denied. A public insult lingers. A private agreement dissolves quietly. A public agreement binds reputations. The Forum became a space where accountability emerged naturally, not through punishment, but through memory. People began to act as if they were being judged. And in time they were. Conflict did not disappear in shared space. It became performative. Disputes moved from private retaliation to public argument. This shift was profound. To argue publicly is to accept rules. You must be heard. You must be understood. You must restrain violence long enough to persuade. The Forum did not create peace. It created delay. Delay allowed alternatives to force. Delay allowed tempers to cool. Delay allowed others to intervene. In this way, the Forum became a school, not of harmony, but of containment. Rome learned to survive disagreement without immediate fracture. At this stage, the Forum was still unadorned. No statues proclaimed values. No inscriptions declared laws. No architecture fixed meaning. This absence was a strength. Meaning remained flexible. Practices could evolve. Customs could be tested and abandoned. The space adapted to those who used it. Monuments freeze memory. The early forum allowed it to flow. This openness made it resilient. In the hills, lineage still mattered. In the valley, reputation grew in importance. Who spoke clearly? Who mediated fairly? Who honored agreements? These traits earned influence. Such influence was fragile. It could be lost through arrogance, deception, or failure to contribute. Power in the forum was never guaranteed, only renewed through conduct. This instability prevented the early consolidation of absolute authority. Rome's later suspicion of kingship finds its roots here, in a space where dominance had to be justified daily. As gatherings became regular, expectation formed. People began to arrive assuming others would be present. Absence became noticeable. Participation became normative. This is how public life begins, not with law but with habit. Once expectation exists, behavior shifts. Time is structured around meetings. Decisions anticipate response. Identity adjusts to participation. To be absent repeatedly was to withdraw from the community. The forum quietly defined who belonged. Rituals began to appear, offerings, gestures, shared observances, but the space resisted full consecration. No single god dominated. No priesthood controlled access. The forum remained open enough to accommodate many practices, without being owned by any. This balance between sacred and secular would define Roman public life for centuries. The space was respected but not removed from daily use. Reverence coexisted with argument, ritual with trade. Rome did not separate life into clean categories. It layered them. Over time, something remarkable occurred. People began to think of themselves not just as members of a hill or clan, but as participants in a shared process. Not subjects, not citizens yet. Participants. This identity was procedural, not emotional. It was defined by action rather than belief. To belong was to show up, to speak, to listen, to accept outcome. Rome's identity emerged not from myth, but from practice. Even as the forum gained importance, it resisted closure. It was never finished, never complete, never fully defined. Each generation reshaped it, physically and socially. This openness allowed Rome to absorb change without losing continuity. The forum did not tell Romans who they were. It asked them repeatedly to decide. And in answering, again and again, Rome learned to exist as more than a collection of hills. In the next chapter, we will examine how this negotiated space transformed memory itself, turning repeated presence into tradition, and tradition into the earliest form of Roman public authority. A place becomes public not when it is declared so, but when it is remembered collectively. By the time regular exchange had taken hold in the valley, the Roman Forum had begun to change the way Romans related to time, reputation, and one another. What mattered now was not just what happened, but who remembered it and where. Memory, once private and familial, started to drift outward. Markets do not require permanence. They require predictability. The same people arriving at roughly the same place, at roughly the same times, create rhythm. Rhythm creates memory. Someone remembers where they stood last time. Someone recalls who cheated, who honored weight, who spoke falsely. Someone anticipates who will return. Trade becomes more than transaction. It becomes narrative. Over time, these narratives accumulate. This is where it happened. This is where we agreed. This is where he spoke. The forum began to store memory without writing. Rome at this stage had no archives, no codified law, no inscriptions meant for permanence. What it had instead was witness. Words spoken in the forum were heard by many. Actions taken there were seen. Disputes settled there were recalled long after the parties departed. This visibility transformed memory from something inherited to something shared. A family remembers its own past. A community remembers what it saw together. The forum allowed memory to escape bloodlines. As memory accumulated, reputation gained weight. A man known for fair dealing could speak louder than one of higher birth. A mediator trusted by many carried authority without title. A habitual liar found fewer listeners. This was not equality, but it was fluidity. Reputation could rise or fall. Influence had to be maintained. Authority required performance. Rome's later obsession with honor, dignity, and public standing begins here, in a space where memory made behavior durable. Before courts there was judgment. Not formal, not codified, but real. Crowds murmured approval or disapproval. Silence followed some speakers. Attention followed others. These reactions mattered. They shaped outcomes. To lose standing in the forum was to lose access to influence. To be ignored publicly was to be diminished socially. This was power diffuse, informal but effective. Rome learned to govern through attention long before it governed through law. What is striking about early forum memory is how unsymbolic it was. No grand narratives, no heroic cycles, no fixed origin stories. Memory remained practical. Who did what? Who kept faith? Who broke it? Only later would Rome mythologize itself. At this stage, memory served function, not identity. This made it adaptable. Mistakes could be corrected. Customs could change. Practices could evolve. Nothing was frozen yet. As gatherings became regular, time itself shifted. Days were marked by expectation, seasons by activity, presence by habit. People began to plan around the forum. This planning marks the beginning of public time structured not by household needs alone, but by communal rhythms. Rome did not yet count years as we know them, but it had begun to live together in time. Markets draw people in. Once gathered, other things follow. Discussions widen. Complaints surface. Decisions are tested aloud. The forum did not need to become an assembly by decree. It became one by gravity. When many listen, someone will speak. When many speak, someone will decide. When decisions repeat, authority emerges. This authority was not absolute. It was provisional, contested, and fragile. But it was public. With public memory comes public expectation. People begin to anticipate outcomes. Fairness in exchange. Consistency in judgment. Restraint in conflict. When these expectations are violated, reaction follows. This is the beginning of accountability. Not enforced by punishment, enforced by withdrawal of trust. Rome learned to regulate itself socially before it did so legally. Belonging had once been inherited, now it was enacted. To belong was to participate, to be known, remembered, recognized. Those absent from the forum faded from collective memory. Those present shaped it. This created a quiet but powerful boundary. Rome was no longer just a place you lived. It was a place you appeared. Before Rome built monuments to preserve memory, it relied on people. Before it carved law, it rehearsed custom. Before it proclaimed identity, it practiced coexistence. The forum became the city's memory, not because it recorded the past, but because it made the past visible. And once a community remembers together, it can begin to imagine a future together. In the next chapter, we will explore how this remembered space began to acquire sacred meaning, not through temples alone, but through ritual, boundary, and restraint, as Rome edged closer to formal authority without yet surrendering flexibility. Long before the Forum was governed by statutes, it was governed by restraint, not enforced by officials, not written on stone, but understood. As memory accumulated in the Roman Forum, so too did a sense that certain actions belonged there, and certain actions did not. This distinction did not begin as law. It began as ritual. Ritual is older than rule. Boundary precedes authority. The Forum did not become sacred all at once. No single dedication transformed it. No god claimed it exclusively. Instead, sacredness emerged gradually, from repetition, from caution, from the growing awareness that this was a place where the community encountered itself. People behaved differently there. Voices lowered. Gestures slowed. Violence hesitated. This was not fear of punishment. It was fear of violation, of crossing an invisible line that others recognized. Sacredness here was social before it was theological. One of the most remarkable aspects of early Forum ritual is what it lacked. No enclosing walls. No restricted access. No permanent priestly monopoly. And yet boundaries were felt. Certain acts, murder, desecration, unrestrained violence, were avoided not because they were illegal, but because they were unthinkable in that space. This distinction matters. Law can be defied. Ritual is harder to break because it is internalized. Rome learned early that control did not require constant enforcement, only shared understanding. At certain points within the Forum, this sense of restraint intensified. Later generations would identify places like the Lapis Niger, associating them with ancient prohibitions and forgotten transgressions. Even when the meanings faded, the caution remained. People avoided stepping there casually. Voices lowered nearby. Movement adjusted. This persistence of respect, even without clarity, reveals something crucial. Meaning endured even when explanation did not. Rome was learning to preserve authority through tradition, not instruction. Ritual did practical work. It slowed interaction. It structured behavior. It prevented escalation. A gesture of offering delayed argument. A shared silence replaced interruption. A formal posture restrained impulse. These actions bought time. Time allowed reason to surface. Time allowed others to intervene. Time allowed the community to assert itself. Ritual was Rome's first conflict management system. Early Roman religion was plural, overlapping, and adaptable. No single god monopolized the Forum. No cult dictated its use. This mattered deeply. A space claimed by one deity becomes exclusive. A space shared by many remains open. Rituals in the Forum reinforced coexistence rather than hierarchy. They allowed different groups to recognize one another's practices without surrendering their own. Rome's later religious tolerance has roots here, not in philosophy, but in necessity. The concept of pollution, not physical but moral, shaped behavior. Certain acts were believed to contaminate shared space, requiring cleansing or avoidance. This belief reinforced restraint without formal sanction. To pollute the Forum was to offend not just gods, but neighbors. This social dimension made pollution a powerful deterrent. It tied personal conduct to collective consequence. At this stage, Rome had no sovereign authority capable of imposing order consistently. Kings, if they existed, were limited. Councils were informal. And yet order emerged. Not because power was centralized, but because space was respected. The forum did not require a ruler to function. It required participants to recognize its importance. This inversion would shape Roman political thought for centuries. Authority was not assumed to descend from rulers. It was expected to emerge from recognized spaces and practices. Rituals repeated in the forum became memory anchors. This is how it is done here. This is what we do when we gather. This is what we do not do. Such phrases do not require writing. They survive through imitation. Children observed. Newcomers learned. Outsiders adjusted. The forum trained behavior across generations without instruction. Ritual is not infallible. When boundaries were crossed, when violence erupted or taboo was violated, the shock was profound. Such moments lingered in memory far longer than routine gatherings. They became warnings. Stories circulated. Places were avoided. Caution increased. Failure reinforced the system. Rome learned not only from success, but from rupture. By the time formal law would appear inscribed, debated, enforced, much of its work had already been done. People were accustomed to restraint. They recognized shared boundaries. They accepted that public space required public behavior. Law would later codify what ritual had already normalized. This sequence matters. Rome did not become lawful by suppressing impulse. It became lawful by training it. Despite its growing sanctity, the forum never became untouchable. Trade continued. Arguments persisted. Everyday life unfolded. Sacredness did not remove the space from use. It shaped how use occurred. This balance between reverence and practicality would become one of Rome's defining traits. The forum was not a temple. It was a place where the human and the sacred overlapped. By the end of this phase, Rome stood at a threshold. It possessed shared memory, recognized boundaries, ritualized restraint. What it lacked was formalized power. That power would come slowly, unevenly, and when it did, it would anchor itself in the forum. In the next chapter, we will examine how influence, leadership, and early authority began to take shape within this sacred, yet contested space, and how Rome learned to exercise power without yet becoming an empire. Power arrived in the forum before it arrived in Rome. Not as domination, not as command, but as influence, fragile, visible, and constantly tested. By the time the Roman Forum had become a place of memory and ritual, it was already shaping authority. The question was no longer whether people would gather there, but who would speak, who would decide, and why others would listen. Rome's earliest power was not enforced. It was recognized. In the Forum, leadership did not come from title, it came from presence. Those who appeared regularly became familiar. Those who spoke clearly became trusted. Those who mediated fairly became influential. Absence eroded authority. Silence diminished standing. Power in the forum had to be performed repeatedly. This made leadership exhausting and unstable, but it also made it accountable. No one ruled from a distance. Speech became Rome's earliest political tool. Not eloquence as later generations would define it, but clarity, restraint, and timing. To speak in the forum was to expose oneself. To interruption, to memory, to judgment. A failed speech lingered longer than a failed action. This pressure refined behavior. People learned to appeal to custom rather than force. Reference shared memory. Anticipate objection. Rome's later rhetorical culture did not emerge in schools. It emerged in this open, unforgiving space. Early Rome lacked the machinery of coercion. No standing army enforcing decisions. No police maintaining order. no bureaucracy executing commands. And yet decisions were made and followed. How? Because influence replaced coercion. Those who ignored communal outcomes risked isolation. Those who violated expectations faced withdrawal of trust. These sanctions were social, not physical, but they were effective. Rome learned that power could operate without violence, so long as participation mattered. The most influential figures were not those who dominated, but those who resolved. Mediators gained standing because they reduced conflict without escalating it. They preserved relationships. They protected shared space. This skill was rare and valued. To mediate successfully was to demonstrate understanding of multiple perspectives. It required patience, memory, and restraint. Rome's earliest authority figures were not commanders. They were balancers. Forum authority had clear limits. No one could compel permanent obedience. No decision was irreversible. No leader was immune to challenge. This instability frustrated later Roman thinkers who would idealize strong leadership. But at this stage, it was a strength. It prevented consolidation. It preserved flexibility. It allowed correction. Rome remained adaptable because power could not harden too early. Disagreement did not weaken authority, it tested it. A decision that survived challenge gained legitimacy. A leader who withstood criticism earned respect. This dynamic trained Rome to value endurance over dominance. Power that collapsed under pressure was not power worth keeping. Later tradition would speak of kings in early Rome. If they existed, their authority was limited. They did not rule from palaces. They did not command the forum. They participated in it. Their legitimacy depended on recognition, not fear. This distinction is crucial. Rome did not reject kingship outright. It rejected unaccountable kingship. This resistance was learned in the forum, in a space where power had always been visible and contested. Ultimately, authority in the forum flowed upward. The gathered presence, murmurs, reactions, silence, approval shaped outcomes. This collective was not democratic in a modern sense. Many were excluded, but it was public. Decisions did not disappear into private chambers. They were exposed to reaction. This exposure shaped Rome's later obsession with public legitimacy. Authority attached itself to the forum because the forum made it visible. To speak elsewhere was to lose audience. To decide elsewhere was to risk irrelevance. Power needed the forum more than the forum needed power. This reversal would define Roman political architecture for centuries. At this stage, Rome was not yet outward-looking. Its struggles were internal. Between hills, between families, between expectations. The forum trained Rome to manage these tensions without collapse. This training would later make expansion possible. You cannot rule others if you cannot manage disagreement among yourselves. Rome learned this lesson early, not in conquest but in conversation. As influence stabilized, a new pressure emerged. Memory wanted permanence. Decisions wanted durability. Expectations wanted clarity. The forum had carried Rome far, but it was reaching its limits. Informal authority, however effective, could not scale indefinitely. Rome was approaching the moment when power would demand structure, when memory would demand inscription. In the next chapter, we will explore how the forum began to organize time itself, how repetition turned into calendar, custom into precedent, and public life into something Rome could measure, record, and preserve. Before Rome measured time, it experienced it. Days passed by light and labor, seasons by harvest and flood. Memory flowed without structure, shaped by story and habit rather than count. But once the Roman Forum became the place where people gathered predictably, time itself began to change. Rome did not invent time. It invented shared time. In early Rome, time belonged to households. A family rose when work demanded it. Ritual followed local custom. Obligation was personal. The Forum disrupted this. To gather publicly required synchronization. People had to agree, implicitly at first, on when gathering would occur. Not exact hours, but recognizable moments. After the morning work. Before the heat. When others are there. These vague agreements slowly hardened into expectation. Time became something negotiated, not merely endured. What repeats becomes predictable. What is predictable becomes reliable. What is reliable becomes authoritative. Markets returned on familiar days. Assemblies clustered around known moments. Rituals marked transitions. Over time, these repetitions formed a rhythm that people began to anticipate. Anticipation is the seed of calendrical thinking. Rome learned to expect itself. As ritual deepened, distinctions emerged. Some days felt appropriate for dispute, exchange, and decision. Others did not. Certain moments were avoided not by law but by custom. This division laid the groundwork for what would later become the fasti. Lists of days marked as suitable or unsuitable for public action. But long before such lists were written, they were lived. People simply knew. Today is not a day for argument. Today is not a day for judgment. Today we wait. Time acquired moral weight. As public life repeated, memory attached itself not only to place, but to time. This happened on such a day. This always happens around now. This must be done before that. These associations stabilized expectation. Rome began to think forward and backward collectively. This was a profound shift. A society that shares time can plan. A society that plans can govern. A society that governs can endure. Control of public time became power. Those who could declare when assemblies met, when rituals occurred, or when business was suspended wielded immense influence. At first, this control was informal. Later, it would become institutionalized, guarded, debated, and contested. But its origin lies here, in the Forum's need to coordinate presence. Time became a civic resource. The Forum was where time was made visible. You could see whether a gathering was large or small. You could feel whether a moment was appropriate. You could sense whether delay or action was expected. This sensory experience mattered. Time was not abstract. It was embodied. Rome learned to read time through behavior. When actions repeat in the same space at the same moments, they acquire legitimacy. This is how it has been done. This is how it is done. This is how it should be done. Precedent emerged not from decree, but from consistency. This logic would later define Roman law, but its roots are temporal, not legal. Rome respected what endured. Eventually, memory strained under complexity. Too many gatherings, too many rituals, too many exceptions. What was once remembered had to be noted. The impulse to record time did not arise from obsession with order, but from fear of forgetting. Writing entered Roman public life cautiously, as a servant of memory rather than its replacement. The Forum prepared Rome for inscription by first training it to care about when things happened. Just as ritual marked spatial boundaries, time marked behavioral ones. To act at the wrong time was to offend. To speak out of turn was to provoke. To ignore timing was to appear dangerous. This sensitivity reinforced restraint. Rome learned that power exercised at the wrong moment was no power at all. By now, Rome was no longer merely a place. It was a rhythm people lived inside. Daily life bent around public expectation. Private activity adjusted to communal cadence. This was not yet bureaucracy. It was coordination. And it worked. Shared time demanded sacrifice. Personal schedules bent to public need. Household autonomy diminished. Private urgency was sometimes delayed. But the reward was continuity. Rome gained the ability to act together. This mastery of time preceded Rome's mastery of space. Before it ruled territories, Rome ruled calendars. Before it marched outward, it synchronized inward. This internal discipline would later allow Rome to govern far-flung lands, because it had already learned to govern itself temporally. As time became structured, pressure grew for permanence. If time could be marked, why not decisions? If precedent mattered, why not preserve it? If memory governed, why not formalize it? Rome stood at another threshold. The Forum had taught it how to gather, remember, restrain, and synchronize. What remained was to decide how to fix these practices without destroying their flexibility. In the next chapter, we will examine how conflict returned, sharper, louder, and more dangerous, and how the Forum became the arena where Rome learned to survive political tension without tearing itself apart. Conflict did not interrupt Rome's development. It revealed it. By the time the Roman Forum had become a space of shared time, memory, and ritual, disagreement could no longer remain private. Tensions that once dissolved within families or hills now surfaced in public, visible, audible, and consequential. This was not a failure of unity. It was its consequence. Private conflict is limited. Public conflict reshapes identity. Once disputes unfolded in the Forum, they ceased to be merely personal. They became examples, precedents, warnings. A quarrel observed by many demanded resolution that others could accept, not because it was perfect, but because it preserved the space itself. The Forum could tolerate disagreement. It could not survive chaos. As crowds grew, conflict required structure. Not written rules yet, but patterns. People gathered in recognizable formations. Certain voices spoke first. Others responded. Over time, these patterns hardened into expectation. This was the birth of assembly, not as institution, but as behavior. Assemblies did not emerge to express harmony. They emerged to contain tension. In the Forum, listening became power. To be heard required restraint from others. To allow someone to finish speaking was an act of collective discipline. Interruptions carried meaning. Silence carried meaning. Noise carried meaning. Rome learned to read these signals. Agreement was not always verbal. Disapproval did not always shout. This sensitivity to crowd behavior would later shape Roman political practice, where reaction mattered as much as speech. Public gathering amplifies emotion. Anger spreads faster in crowds. Fear becomes contagious. Confidence can tip into arrogance. The Forum was not immune to this. Moments of escalation occurred, moments when restraint faltered and the space teetered on violence. These moments left deep impressions. They taught Rome a crucial lesson. Crowds require limits. Not walls. Not weapons. But expectations. The community learned when to intervene, when to quiet, when to disperse. Conflict revealed leaders. Anyone could speak in calm times. Few could hold attention when tension rose. Those who could. Slow escalation. Reframe grievances. Propose compromise. Earned lasting authority. This authority was fragile. One failure could erase it. Rome learned to value tested leadership, influence proven under pressure. As conflicts repeated, something new emerged. People began to speak not only for themselves, but for groups. This affects us. This harms many. This is not acceptable. The language of collective interest took shape. This was not ideology. It was experience. Shared conflict created shared perspective. Rome began to think politically, not because it desired power, but because it needed to manage difference at scale. What makes this phase remarkable is what did not happen. The Forum did not become a battlefield. Violence occurred elsewhere, on hills, at boundaries, in moments of rupture, but the Forum resisted militarization. Weapons were avoided. Ritual boundaries restrained force. Witnesses discouraged escalation. This restraint preserved the space as a place of resolution rather than domination. Rome learned to argue without destroying itself. Unity did not come from consensus. It came from survival. Rome remained intact not because it agreed, but because it had learned how to disagree publicly. This skill became a defining trait. Other communities fractured under tension. Rome adapted. The Forum trained Romans to endure internal strain, a trait that would later allow them to absorb conquered peoples, rival elites, and competing traditions. Public conflict demanded courage. To speak was to risk humiliation. To challenge was to risk isolation. To lose was to be remembered. These risks filtered participation. Not everyone spoke, not everyone could. But the fact that speech was possible mattered. It created the idea that authority could be challenged, even if not always successfully. As conflict intensified, informal patterns strained. Memory alone could not carry every grievance. Custom alone could not resolve every dispute. Pressure mounted for clarity. Rome was approaching the moment when public life would require formal expression, when spoken expectation would harden into rule. But that step would not erase the Forum's earlier lessons. Law would be built on top of habit, not in place of it. By now, Rome had developed something rare. A political identity rooted not in myth or conquest, but in process. To be Roman was to appear publicly, accept scrutiny, endure disagreement, submit to shared outcome. This identity was incomplete, exclusionary, and fragile. But it was real. Despite tension, the Forum endured. It absorbed conflict without collapsing. It adapted without losing continuity. This endurance became proof of concept. Rome could survive itself. Rome remembered its beginning as a moment. The Forum reveals it as a process. Long after the Roman Forum had shaped daily life, Romans chose to anchor their identity to a single year, a clean number, a named founder, a decisive act. The story of 753 BCE offered clarity. It offered certainty. It offered origin. The Forum offered none of these. And that is precisely why it mattered more. Founding myths serve a purpose. They simplify. They unify. They silence ambiguity. A city born in a single act can imagine itself as destined. A people descended from one founder can imagine themselves as coherent. But Rome was never simple. Its origins were layered, negotiated, revised, shaped by geography, labor, conflict, memory, and restraint. These realities resist myth. The Forum preserved them anyway. What the Forum teaches us is that Rome did not begin when someone drew a boundary or named a date. It began when people returned to the same place, accepted shared obligation, endured disagreement without separation. This beginning had no ceremony. It unfolded gradually through habit. Rome did not start by declaring unity. It practiced it imperfectly, repeatedly, publicly. The Forum was too human to become a clean story. It contained failure, delay, compromise, revision. There was no single hero to elevate, no final victory to commemorate. Even when monuments rose later, they layered meaning rather than replaced it. The Forum accumulated memory instead of overwriting it. This made it difficult to turn into legend, but invaluable as foundation. Before Rome ruled others, it learned how to live with itself. The Forum trained Romans to coordinate without coercion, respect space without walls, recognize authority without surrender. These skills preceded empire. They explain why Rome could absorb outsiders, adapt institutions, and survive internal tension longer than many rivals. Empire was not Rome's first achievement. Coexistence was. Roman law did not emerge fully formed from wisdom or philosophy. It crystallized from practice. By the time laws were written, public behavior was already patterned. Authority was already visible. Expectation was already shared. Law formalized what the Forum had already taught. This is why Roman law endured. It rested on lived experience, not abstraction. Rome remembered itself through space. The Forum became a physical archive, not because it recorded events, but because it held them. Each generation walked over layers of past decisions, past conflicts, past compromises. The ground itself became testimony. This continuity mattered more than any date. A founding year can be argued. A shared place cannot be erased. The establishment of the Forum around 625 BCE does not offer a dramatic story. No wolf, no fratricide, no divine sign. What it offers instead is something rarer, evidence of collective will. It marks the moment when Rome chose to invest in shared space, to drain it, maintain it, and return to it despite inconvenience and risk. That choice was repeated across generations. Rome did not inherit unity. It maintained it. Rome's greatness did not begin with conquest. It began with patience, with the willingness to wait for others to speak, return after conflict, maintain what benefits all. The Forum embodies this greatness. Not monumental, not triumphant, but durable. The Forum reminds us that civilizations do not always rise through decisive moments. Sometimes they rise through repetition, restraint, shared effort. Rome endured because it learned how to gather before it learned how to rule. Today the Forum appears silent, broken stone beneath open sky. But its silence is deceptive. It once held arguments, bargains, rituals, and unresolved tension. It trained a people to live publicly before they learned to dominate others. If Rome had never conquered an empire, the Forum would still matter, because it reveals how a city learned to exist. Rome's founding myth tells us when Rome began. The Forum tells us how Rome became Rome. And in that distinction lies the true origin of one of history's most enduring political cultures. Not in a single year, not in a single man, but in a marsh between hills slowly drained, repeatedly returned to, and never fully owned by anyone alone. When Rome fell, the Forum did not disappear. Empires ended. Institutions collapsed. Languages shifted. But the space remained, altered, buried, reused, remembered. The Roman Forum outlived the people who built it because it was never only theirs. It was a method more than a monument, a habit more than a law. When authority fractured, the Forum lost its centrality, but not its meaning. Stones were repurposed, paths were forgotten, grass overtook marble, yet even in neglect the space retained gravity. Later generations sensed that something important had once happened there, not a single event, but a way of living together. Civilizations can abandon buildings. They struggle to abandon practices. The Forum offers no inscription explaining itself. It does not declare values. It does not announce purpose. It does not instruct. And yet it teaches. It teaches that shared life precedes shared belief. That public restraint matters before public law. That coexistence is learned through repetition, not revelation. These lessons are not Roman alone. They are human. Founding myths close the past. Shared spaces keep it open. Rome's legendary beginning gave it identity. The Forum gave it endurance. Every generation that returned to that valley refounded Rome, not with ceremony, but with choice. To show up, to listen, to argue without destroying the space that made argument possible. The Forum story endures because it describes a fragile achievement. Not unity, not harmony, but continuity. The ability to remain in the same place with others who disagree, and to keep returning anyway. That achievement is never final. It must be renewed. There is no triumphant conclusion here. Only an image of worn stone, shaped by feet, voices, weather, and time. The Forum does not ask to be admired. It asks to be understood. And if Rome teaches anything at its deepest level, it is this. Civilizations do not begin when someone declares them founded. They begin when people choose, again and again, to share a space they could have abandoned. And they endure only as long as they keep making that choice. If you'd like to keep exploring history's biggest questions, you're welcome to subscribe and continue this journey. And if there's a moment from the past you think deserves a deeper look, feel free to share it in the comments.